You are there, Nay? Good, good evening, Dr.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Steve?
Very good, thank you very much. So, I I've known Naomi for quite a few years, and it was actually a colleague that reached out and invited us. So it was a nice surprise to see Naomi on the speakers list. It's always good to catch up. Me and Naomi worked together for 4, maybe 5 years within the England women's setup as well. So it's great to have you on board with this as well, Naomi. Thank you.
No problem.
I'm going to shut up now because you hear my voice too much as well. And I'll let you share screens and hand over to you if that's okay.
No problem at all.
Thank you again for coming on today.
You're welcome. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen there.
Yep, all good. Thank you, Naomi.
Okay, so thank you for tuning in to this session. As Steve said, my name is Dr. Naomi Datson, and today I'm going to talk about talent ID in female soccer, so talent identification within the female game. Just before I start, just want to thank Playermaker for, first of all, inviting me to participate in this webinar. But secondly, and more importantly, thank you to Playermaker for hosting this really important event. Also, big shout out to Steve, who's done a fantastic job of hosting throughout the day. I probably will interchange between the terms soccer and football, so please forgive me for that, but rest assured I am talking about the same game. So before I kind of get into Talent ID specifically, just to give a little bit of a background to myself, I've been lucky enough to spend about 17 years or so working in elite female soccer, and the majority of that time, as Steve alluded to, was spent at the English Football Association. So I started off working with some of the younger age groups and primarily worked with the under-19 team, and just a happy snap there of when the team won the gold medal at the European Championships in 2009. And working with these younger age groups really sort of got me interested within the talent identification and talent development space. After working with the younger age groups, I moved on to work with the senior team, and I worked with that team for around about 5 years. And again, just a happy snap there of when the team won the bronze medal at the World Cup in 2015. As well as working for the FA, I've had other experiences within the female game. I spent some time working at the Australian Institute of Sport, working there with their elite players. And then since leaving the FA, I've continued to work in the game in a number of different capacities, some as a researcher and some as a consultant. So currently supervising a PhD student at Celtic and also doing some consultancy work for the Northern Ireland women's teams. In terms of my day job, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Chichester. So for reference, Chichester is a small city on the south coast in the UK. It's a traditional city. As you can see, we've got some lovely buildings in terms of the cathedral, but also on our university campus. But if we think about today's talk, Chichester also has a strong history within women's football. So they've got a rich history of developing coaches and developing players. And we are also one of the FA's women's high performance football centres, of which there are only 11 within the UK. We also have a significant research area within sports science and women's football, which I actively participate in. So in terms of an overview of the presentation today, hopefully those initial slides have given you a little bit of an introduction to myself and some of my previous and current experiences. But for the rest of the time, I really just want to focus on talent ID. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a background to the area and then look at the research. So look at what the current status is of talent ID research within the women's game. I then want to focus on a couple of contemporary studies and then just finish up with where we need to move forward. So what are the future directions for this area of research? So talent ID has been a hot topic within sport performance, but also within soccer research for the last 20 years. So it's quite a long time to be popular. We know it's popular because there have been and there continue to be numerous research articles published in the area. But I think the thing that makes Talent ID a little bit different is that, as well as research articles, there are a large number of books published in the area, and it really is popular to many people. I myself have these 6 books on my bookshelf, and I'm sure many of you in the audience will have come across these books and perhaps read them as well. So I think this is why Talent ID is a little bit different. I think people as humans, I think we're really interested in the progression of players. So which players are going to make it and which players are going to be successful. But I guess more importantly than that, which players are going to make it, but also why are those players going to make it and be successful? So we all know that soccer is big business across the world. And when we're thinking about Talent ID and talent development, this is hugely important for coaches and practitioners. It's kind of the cornerstone of their practice. It's why they get involved within the game. They want to help identify and develop these players. But I guess with Talent ID, it is important across a number of key stakeholders. So, for example, the board members, they would also have an interest in Talent ID and development. And that may be because they want that player to succeed, but also it's possibly from a financial and or a commercial aspect as well. So I really think Talent ID is, so important to a number of different stakeholders. So I just want to, first of all, give a little framework to Talent ID and development. And this model that I'm going to show you was taken from a recent paper by Mark Williams. And it's probably something that you're all fairly familiar with in terms of a sort of Talent ID and development structure. So players will be participating in the sport, and then some players will be identified as potentially having talent. So those players that are identified may then enter a talent development program. And within that program, it's likely to have systematic training and systematic match play. So the players will enter a kind of continual cycle of development and selection. Now, as you'll see on the diagram, there are points marked by the blue arrows where players may enter and exit the program. But even perhaps when a player has been deselected from a development program, they may then re-enter the pathway at a different point. So perhaps they may come back in at identification, or they may come back in at participation. So this is a kind of general framework of Talent ID and development. When we think about talent development, we often fall into the trap of thinking that it's a straight line, a linear approach, that a player will go from being a young player and then they will progress all the way through to being a senior player, and it will be a nice straight line and everything will be great. Unfortunately, talent development isn't necessarily like that. And as you can see from the diagram on the right hand side, it can be a really complex process where there can be ups and there can be downs. I think the reason that we think often that talent development is a sort of straight line linear process is because what we see often is the success stories. So we see the players who win the medals, we see the players who win the trophies. What we don't always see are those down periods, or the times when a player may have been deselected. So when we think about talent development, it is a complex process. And part of the reason for that is because our talented youth players don't always go on to become our talented adult performers. And actually, youth success may only be a weak predictor of success at senior level. And I'm sure we can all kind of understand and appreciate why that is. There's a complex interaction of many factors, whether they are physiological, psychological, or social. And all of these factors can influence our sort of development pathway. So in terms of women's football, as I'm sure you all know, as you've tuned in to this webinar today, but the women's game is going from strength to strength across a number of different areas. So if we look at participation, year on year, we see the figures growing. In 2014, FIFA estimated that there were 30 million players worldwide, but they have a goal to increase that, or to double it, to 60 million by 2026. As well as increases in participation, FIFA are also backing the game financially. So after the 2019 World Cup, FIFA doubled their investment to $1 billion over the next 4-year period. So the game really is going from strength to strength. However, as with any area, there are always, aspects for improvement. And in 2019, when FIFA conducted their members survey, the one thing that was highlighted was that there needs to be improvements in the development of players from grassroots to elite. And that really fits in kind of the space of today's talk in terms of that talent ID and development. And then if we think about talent ID from a research perspective, just want to point out this journal, so the Journal of Sports Sciences, and in the year 2000, they ran a special edition on talent ID. And one of the lead articles within that special edition by Mark Williams and Tom Riley actually found that there was a real lack of evidence or real lack of research within talent ID in the female game. So they really kind of called that over, the next amount of time, we really needed to focus our efforts on researching in the female game, particularly within this talent ID and development space. Now, if we fast forward 20 years, the Journal of Sports Sciences did another special edition on talent ID. And unfortunately, one of the kind of lead articles recognized that actually there wasn't a whole lot of research on talent ID in female players. So despite this kind of call for more research in 2000, even when we got to 2020, there still wasn't a lot of research. And particularly, there wasn't a lot of research which focused on non-European players. So we can see for, FIFA member survey asking for more work in this area, and also on the research side, looking and calling out for more talent ID and development research. So that kind of got me thinking. My PhD focused on the demands of match play and fitness testing, and it was a fairly descriptive PhD, just starting some of the initial studies within the female game. But whilst I was conducting my PhD, I had an idea about an area of future research. And what I really wanted to know was, as you can see on this diagram on the right-hand side, we've got a development pathway of the England teams at the time when I was undertaking my PhD. And so as part of my PhD, we had fitness testing data for the FA Girls National Performance Camp players. So that's the players that are here highlighted in the green. And what I was interested in, particularly around this talent ID area, was would we be able to have a look and see how these players tested when they were in their national performance camp? And if there was any way we could predict which of those players would then go on to the next stage, i.e. the blue stage, where they would represent England competitively at an age group. So this was an idea for a study, and the study came to fruition. As you can see, this is the title of the study that I conducted with colleagues. And just over the next few slides, I'm just going to kind of share what we did and what we found. So in terms of the rationale for the study, as I said, I was working within an international association. And I guess while I was working there, I really sort of started to understand this talent ID and development phase. And actually, if a team want to, they need a new centre forward, if that's a club team, they've got the option to potentially go out and buy a new centre forward. Whereas for an international team, they don't have that option to go and purchase players. So arguably, this talent ID and development space is even more important for international teams than perhaps it might be for club teams. When we talk about identifying talent, as I've already alluded to, it's quite a complex process. And the research that is out there basically suggests there's kind of two ways to look at this. So we can either prospectively track players, so we can assess players and then we can track how they get on throughout their career. Or the other option is to retrospectively trace career progression, which is what we did in this study. As I said, there's a lack of research within the female game, within Talent ID. Some positive work in the male game showing that testing of youth players may be helpful for predicting future career. But at the point when we did this study, there was no information really available on females. So what did we do? As I said, we used a retrospective analysis. So we had fitness testing data for youth players who had been recognised as having potential. So these players in the national performance camps. And then what we did in our study was we looked to see where these players ended up. So had these players who were tested within the national performance camp, had they gone on to represent England at a competitive level, or had they not been successful in that? In terms of the number of participants, we had data for nearly 300 youth players, and they ranged in ages from 12.7 to 15.3 years. And in terms of the fitness testing and the data that we looked at, we had anthropometric data. So there we looked at players' height, sitting height, body mass, and sum of 8 skin folds. We also had physical performance tests. So we had jump scores, counter movement jump. We had speed scores over 10 and 30 meters. And we also had yo-yo intermittent recovery test. So a marker of high intensity endurance. All players had been previously familiarised with the testing, and we had also assessed the reliability of these particular tests with this group of players. So in terms of what we found, of the nearly 300 players, 50 of them were successful at being selected for future international squads. And this percentage was similar to what we've found in male soccer and also in Olympic sports. So if we look at that graphically, we can see that of our players in the national performance camp, 22% went on to be selected for these competitive squads, whereas 78% were not selected. So again, just to remind you, we've got our testing of the national performance camps, and then we were looking to see which players went on to be successful and step up into that blue category. Just to show you some of the actual data in terms of the results. So this is for the anthropometric data. So we have information for body mass, for height, and sum of 8 skin folds. And the numbers that you're seeing on the screen are the range of data, so the highest to the lowest. And I think this slide's really quite useful because it shows the huge range that we had for our data for these particular players. And I guess this just underlines as well the stage that these players are in terms of their development. So we've got players at different stages of their growth and maturation and their development pathway, as represented by these really large ranges of data. Then if we move on to the physical performance testing data. So here you can see our 10-meter sprinting results. So we've got kind of two shapes on the slide. The red dots, they represent the players that were not successful. So the players that didn't go on to represent England. We've then got the shape on the right-hand side where we've got the green dots. And that is the players that did go on to represent England at those competitive squads. And then our numbers at the bottom are our means and standard deviations for that group. So if we look at our selected players, i.e. the right-hand side, they had a 10-meter sprinting time of 1.805 seconds, whereas the non-selected players were a little bit slower as a group with a time of 1.841 seconds. And we've got the same pattern again for 30-meter sprinting. So if we look at the group averages, our selected players were a little bit quicker than our non-selected players. Then if we look at our counter movement jump, so our height scores, same pattern here with our selected players scoring better, so jumping higher than our future non-selected players. And again, a similar pattern with our yo-yo intermittent recovery performance. our future selected players scoring better, having a higher test performance than our non-selected players. So just moving this on, we did some statistical analysis within our study. You don't need to worry too much about the numbers or so on this table, but what we really did was we looked at each of our physical performance tests to see if they were able to predict future performance. And our sprints and our counter movement jump weren't able to predict performance, future performance adequately. However, our yo-yo test, as I've indicated by the green box, was actually able to predict future selection. So if we look at this graphically, here you can see along the x-axis, we've got our score from the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. And on our y-axis, we've got our predicted probability of selection. So as we can see, if we look at this graph, the better a player does on the yo-yo test, so the higher distance they cover, the higher chance they've got of being selected for future squads. And to see that in table format, as you can see here, I'll just work through an example. So if a player scored 1,880 meters on the yo-yo test, they would be within the 97.5 percentile of our players, but that player would have a predicted probability of selection of around about 55%, and that would be on average somewhere between 40 and 71%. So we had some reasonable success with using the yo-yo test as a predictor of future performance. So our key finding really was relating to this yo-yo test score, that actually those players who got a higher score were more likely to be selected for future international squads. And that was regardless of their playing position. As with any study, our study was not without limitations. As you can appreciate from the information I've given you, we really just focused on one area, and that was the physical aspect. That's partly because our study was retrospective, so we used the data that we had available. So we had physical data, so that's what we focused on. However, in an ideal world, we would have liked to have combined other areas and other predictors of performance. As I alluded to earlier on in the presentation, talent development is a little bit messy, and within our study, we only used one time point. So we could have improved our study by using multiple time points, but within our design, we weren't actually able to do that. However, just to move on to the second study that I want to talk about, and this came out around about the same time as our study, and this was undertaken by some German researchers. And they were actually able to kind of improve some of the aspects of the things that we'd done within our study. So they looked at technical and tactical performance and physical performance. And they were also able to include a couple of time points as opposed to where we had just focused on one. So to give you an overview of this study, within Germany, the top 4% of players are selected for this talent identification and development program. So within this study, there were over 700 players, and they were measured at different time points within their development program. So these players were measured at under 12s, 13s, 14s, and under 15s. And then these players were prospectively tracked. So they were tracked until they went into the professional game or they didn't achieve professional status. And as I mentioned at the start, this study did include some measures of technical performance as well. So dribbling, ball control, and also shooting ability. And in terms of the physical, they looked at 20-meter sprint and also agility. And what they did in this study was they combined those 5 measures to give a total score, which they termed motor performance. So just to touch on some of the results from this study, this table looks at data for the under 12s, okay? And the data's been divided into 2 columns. So those players that went on to become future professionals and those players that went on to unfortunately not become professionals. And we've got our performance tests in this column here. And as you can see, if we look at the data, our group that went on to become future professionals had a faster sprint time a faster agility time, faster dribbling time, faster ball control. Their shooting score was a little lower, but overall, their total score was higher than it was for the future non-professionals. And this was the same pattern, whether it was the 12s, 13s, 14s, or 15s. So we can see that our group that go on to become professionals were posting better performance scores. Then what I've done with their results from this study is that I've taken one specific area. So I've just taken ball control for now. And in this table, you can see we've got data for each of the different time points they were assessed in the study. So under 12s through to under 15s. And if we look, first of all, just at the future professionals, we can see that as their age increases, we can see that their test score also improves. So they're getting better, they're doing the test quicker. This is also the same for the future non-professionals. So we can see that these players are also getting better at the test as their age increases. And this was the same, although I've picked ball control, this was the same for the other tests that were measured. So we can see that both groups, there was an improvement in test performance as they got older. So actually, the girls coming into the program, those that went on to become future professionals, already had a better motor performance. And whilst they were in the program, that difference was just maintained as they went through the age groups. So in terms of the key findings of this study, the researchers found that this value of motor performance had some prognostic relevance to predicting future adult performance levels. However, they did find that we couldn't use just one of these metrics, and actually in order to enable them to predict performance, they needed to use a combination of all of the performance tests together. Again, no study is without its limitations. So although I mentioned this study had some technical and tactical measures as well as physical measures, those tests that they use in this study were fairly closed skill. So a dribbling test, a ball control test. So the skills weren't as open as we would like to see. There was no decision-making capacity within them. And again, the physical tests, they were quite a narrow view of physical performance. So just a sprint and agility. So there was no measure of repeated sprint endurance or perhaps sort of a yo-yo endurance type test. So I think in terms of talent ID, I think it's fair to say we're heading in the right direction. If we think back to, the two papers, the one in 2000 and then this one in 2020, which basically were calling out for more research within the women's game in talent ID. The two papers that I've spoken about today, so our study on the England players and then this other study by colleagues or researchers in Germany, show that we're starting to head in the right direction. However, our work is never done, and there are future directions, things that we need to consider. And for me, I think the biggest area is about trying to include a more rounded approach to talent ID. So not just thinking in silos, so not just thinking physically or technically or tactically. Can we try to think about the player as a whole to help us identify and then importantly develop those players that can go on to be successful? So a greater consideration of multi-dimensional designs, thinking about open skills. And the other couple of points are around trying to test players at multiple points within their development. So as I said, talent development is quite a complex and messy thing. So if we can try to test players at multiple points, and also just a consideration of cultural differences. So the paper by Mark Williams said a lot of the research had been done in European players. So can we try to extend that? And what are the differences between different players on different continents? What do they need to be successful? Okay, so thank you very much for your time and for listening to the presentation. Not sure how we're doing on time, Steve. Happy to take questions now, or people can obviously contact me on email or Twitter or however they would like.
Thank you first and foremost, Naomi, really appreciate that. So you've actually timed it perfectly to 30 minutes exactly. So what we'll do with regards to the questions and that, any questions I'll flip through to you so that you can answer them offline if that's okay with you.
Absolutely fine, no problem.
Thank you for the insight and love the image at the end. I'm sure everyone during lockdowns looking forward to going to an
One
island.
day we'll get to go on holiday again.
Exactly. Brilliant, Naomi. Thank you very much for that insight into the talent ID. And
No problem. I'll stop sharing my screen.